Chickahominy Indian tribe, and I was asked to come today and talk a little bit about my history, and I was asked to discuss the process, the challenges, and significance of our recent successful effort to gain federal recognition as a sovereign nation within these United States of America. So, I'll give you a little history, and maybe we can talk another day. And I really would like to view my time, but here we are. The Chickahominy tribe was among those tribes that greeted the settlers in 1607, and to a very porous immigration policy, you saw what happened. We were overrun. But let's go back a little. In 1452, Pope Nicholas V wrote what we call or approved the papal bull that has been called Manifest Destiny, or the Doctrine of Discovery, and he presented it to King Alfonso V of Portugal. And that simply stated that Christians were given authority by God if they entered countries that were inhabited by Saracens, which Muslims, or pagans, which they considered us. It was our God-given authority and right to seize the lands and put those folks in perpetual servitude. Hold that thought. And fast forward to 1590, the 1590s, Chief Powhatan was the paramount chief of 35 to 40 tribes within the Tidewater area of Virginia, actually from the fall lines in Richmond down to the Tidewater area. And the Chickahominy tribe, while we weren't part of his chiefdom, we were sufficiently large that we allied with Powhatan in case he or the tribes under his purview, under his leadership, were attacked by enemy forces. So we were allies of Powhatan. So now we go forward to May 13th, 1607. The settlers landed at what's now called Jamestown. On May 14th, 1607, they alighted, they came ashore, and as I said earlier, we didn't have the wall, and we didn't have a very effective immigration policy, and we said, just one boatload, what harm could that be? So, due to really the beneficence, the goodwill of the tribes that lived in that area, the first permanent English settlement ended up being Jamestown, because the efficacy of the bow and arrow to the musket was like 5 to 1. So we could have taken out those people early on and chose not to. So they say no good deed goes unpunished. So in 1610, scant 3.5 years after the settlers landed, Lord Delaware looked at the Paspahegh tribe, which had the dubious distinction of living closest to Jamestown, and he said, this tribe is getting large, they may come in and overthrow us. So he ordered the annihilation of that tribe. And he dispatched his soldiers, and they went down to, or the militia, they went to the Paspahegh land with the singular purpose, I should say, of eradicating the tribe. Well, the chief and some of the male members of the tribe were on a hunting expedition, so they weren't caught up in this. But some of the folks that reported to Delaware headed back to Jamestown, and they took the chief's wife and 2 of his pre-pubescent sons in the boat, taking them back to Jamestown. And on the way back, they said, we were given strict orders, don't bring any hostages back to Jamestown. So they actually threw these 2 young boys into the water, and the writer of the 17th century Virginia militia, William L. Shea, said he blew their brains out. Probably the first recorded gun violence against kids, against children, in what they call the New World. So they took the chief's wife ashore, and they got to thinking, if we take her back to Jamestown, they'll burn her at stake. So they decided collectively to dispatch with her more humanely and ran her through with a sword. So as I said, no good deed goes unpunished. So that was the first, that happened 3.5 years after the initial landing at Jamestown. Fast forward to 1614, the Chickahominy engaged a treaty with the colonists where we offered them 350 to 500 bowmen to help them in the event of an attack by the Spaniards. Conventional wisdom says for every one bowman, there were 5 normal people within the tribe. So if you extrapolate 350 to 500, we could have had as many as 2,500 members in the Chickahominy tribe. So that treaty kept peace for several years. As a matter of fact, it probably afforded the seating of the first English representative government in the United States in 1619. But shortly after that, things kind of went south. In 1622, the historians call it the uprising or the massacre of 1622, when in fact the colonists had just set the treaties aside and had forbidden the Indian people to come and hunt and fish on the lands that they'd hunted on for millennia. So we say it was a brilliant military execution, brilliant military mission where our people actually overthrew the colonists to exact some retribution for being denied access to the lands that they'd hunted and fished on for many years. So we had several treaties in between. The culminating treaty was 1677, where we were deemed sovereign subjects of the crown. That was the Chickahominy and many other signatories to that treaty. It's called the Articles of Peace or Treaty of Middle Plantation, which was signed in Williamsburg. Middle Plantation was dubbed, Williamsburg was dubbed Middle Plantation because of where it sat between the James River, which is the Powhatan River if you want to know the real truth, and the York River, which is really the Pamunkey River, but I won't quibble over those things. But it was called the Articles of Peace, and we were deemed sovereign subjects of the crown. I recognize that's a contradiction in terms. How can you be sovereign and subject? But we were called sovereign subjects of the crown, and the Chickahominy were dispatched from what we call Chickahominy Ridge to a place about 60 miles by road. They say as a crow flies, it's closer, but I don't travel as a crow flies. So, but it's a long distance if you have to walk. So we were taken early on, you know, from our land to a reservation in King William County. But miraculously, by 1750, we'd found our way back home to the Chickahominy Ridge, and wonder of wonders, we'd purchased our land fee simple, which again kind of grates you when it was your land to begin with. Again, we won't argue over fine print. But we came back, and that's where we are today. The College of William and Mary performed archaeological studies and digs along the Chickahominy River, and we agreed in 1999. They came to the tribe and told us what had happened, and we had a ceremony over the remains, and we will properly inter them. And with much serious misgivings and anxiety, and we agreed to take small bone fragments and have them analyzed. And they were dated back to 600 AD. I say that when I was a human resource manager at DuPont, one of the guys got angry with me and said, "Why don't you go back where you came from?" I said, "I can be there in 30 minutes. How long will it take you?" So 600 AD kind of gives a little sense of permanence to who we are and where we are in this land that we call Sina-Kamaka. So if you fast forward to the late 19th century, several folks had come by, and actually they like to study Indians. They came in our communities and studied us, as it were, and actually offered some great documentation. In 1934, with the Indian Reorganization Act, the folks who had lived with us and on a daily basis for quite some time had gone back to Washington, and they called the officials in Virginia and said, "You have Native American tribes within the state, and we need to make sure they're part of this Indian Reorganization Act." Well, in 1924, Walter Ashby Plecker, who was the head of the Bureau of Vital Statistics in Virginia, had written the Racial Integrity Act, which was much heralded by Adolf Hitler. That'll give you a sense of what it looked like. But he was a white supremacist, and he thought that was his mission to eradicate all non-whites. And the way to do it, he came up with this Racial Integrity Act that said if you had one drop of non-white blood, you were colored. And he systematically went through all of the, and I am a person of color, I'm proud of it, I'm an American Indian, a person of color. So he systematically went through and altered birth records. My mom and dad had to go to Washington, D.C. in 1935 to be married. It was illegal to marry as an Indian in Virginia. And if the clerk's office affixed Indian to those public documents, those records, they were subject to a year in jail. My parents could have been in prison for a year for going to for marrying and then coming back to Virginia. But we struggled, and we built our own schools. By the way, Walter Plecker prevailed, and Indian Reorganization Act didn't touch us. We were left out. So we built our own schools, educated our people. We sent our kids to Oklahoma to go to school starting in 1936, and the Commonwealth paid our way, one-way ticket. I think there was less than a subtle hint, if you go, please don't come back. And they paid our tuition. But if I go back to the Racial Integrity Act, you know, the Commonwealth was complicit. The leading universities in Virginia were complicit, where they should have, the academicians should have stood up for us and just from a scholarly perspective, challenged what was going on, but they didn't. So we kind of blast Walter Ashby Plecker, but the whole Commonwealth, the whole power structure was involved. You know, typically, and we learned earlier that when the government says we're out to help you, they help themselves. And that's what happened to us. But we began this federal recognition process after successfully gaining state recognition through Commonwealth of Virginia, which was at the culmination of a 4-year, very rigorous study. There was a study commission that was set up by the Commonwealth of Virginia, a joint study between the House and the Senate. And it was tantamount to the work that we did through the administrative process with the Bureau of Indian Affairs and the legislative process that we engaged with the Congress. I mean, we just poured over our records. We had scholars that worked with us and just opened up everything to look at our records to substantiate who we are. And it's something kind of demeaning and that, degrading, to have to go to a legislature peopled by 535 members and maybe less than 1% are Native Americans. That's pretty humiliating, but that's what we had to do. And I'd like to tip my hat to Ann Loomis, who was Chief of Staff for Senator John Warner at the time, who really, really went to the mat for us, helping us in that process. But we started the legislative process in 1999. And the President Trump, April 29, 2018, signed that bill into law, H.R. 984, but became Public Law 115-121, which accorded federal recognition to the Chickahominy Indian tribe as well as 5 other tribes within the Commonwealth. So today there are 7 federally recognized tribes within the Commonwealth of Virginia. And some of you may not know, the oldest reservations in the United States are in King William County. And when I went to school in Oklahoma in 1965, I didn't have to go there. I went there to junior college, but it had become a tradition, and it's where I wanted to go. Somebody help me with time, because I could talk all day. So let me know. Okay. So I went to Oklahoma, and many tribes out there had never heard of me. And I said, well, guess what? I've never heard of you. Today, there are 573 federally recognized tribes within these United States of America. And I'd be hard-pressed. I may could name 50. But I went to school with a lot of folks who hadn't heard about me. I spoke with the chief of the Cherokee Nation in Oklahoma, in Tahlequah, Oklahoma, 3 or 4 months ago, and he had a picture of one of the members of his tribe who had gone to England in the 19th century. And he says, this was the first Indian to go to England from the United States. I said, well, not really so. Maybe the United States, but in 16, I think around 1614 or 15, Pocahontas, who married an Englishman, went to England. I said, so I may diminish your bragging rights just a little bit, but when I look at our history, it's filled with with comedy and tragedy. It's filled with bliss and with sadness. I mean, that's what life is, and you can't tell your story without, if I tell my story and I don't tell the bad parts or the parts that are painful, then you really don't have my history. We went through a lot of struggles, and the struggle was to be who we are. I didn't have a choice in 1945, December 3rd, 1945. God didn't say, Steve, you're getting ready to be born. What race do you want to be? And if I'd had a chance to step back and look at the landscape, I probably would have been blonde-haired and blue-eyed, because they were in the driver's seat. And it's not an indictment against the white race. It's a fact that majority rules. And the majority in the United States at that time happened not to be people of color. So I would have wanted to be with the winners, and my kids hate to hear me say that, but hey, I'm sorry. That's, being in the driver's seat is pretty decent, even though my wife is a great backseat driver. Actually, she's a much better driver than I am. But I didn't have a choice in being an American Indian. That's the cards I was dealt. And I couldn't have asked for a better mom and dad or community to be raised in. Samaria Baptist Church was kind of the social hub of our community, and from that sprang up our church, our school, and our social being. Everything emanated from that church. So I was fortunate to be brought up in a strong environment, nurturing environment, where we loved each other and we respected the people in the community. And we have maintained a high level of respect within the community, all these years, because in my view, according basic dignity and respect to my fellow man is not an option. It's what we have to do and what we ought to do. But with federal recognition, what does that do for the tribes? What it does for me initially, and I shared this with Ann many years ago, it's a source of pride. It's an official stamp, as it were, that you are the people that you've known yourselves to be all your life. Now the rest of the world knows it. It knows that it shows that the Treaty of 1677, which deemed me a sovereign subject of the Crown, that relationship, my relationship to society, to this earth that I love, hasn't changed. January 29th, 2018, with the signing of the bill, then the United States acknowledged what we had known all of our lives. And I got there on the shoulders of my ancestors. A lot of people give me credit for hanging in there, but my foundation remains my mother, my father, their mothers and fathers, and on back. Within the Native community, we believe it's our God-given challenge, responsibility to protect our environment for the next 7 generations. And that environment is both land, water, land, water, and air, but it's also that fiber, that thread that should unite us all, which says to be good to your fellow man. The Bible says, love your neighbors yourself. And that's part of what has been instilled in me all my life. So it transcends those things of Mother Nature, and it goes to the relationships that we need to share around this room. I wouldn't mention that doctrine of discovery. Chief Justice John Marshall, the underpinnings of lots of his rulings were based on that doctrine of discovery, which said if Christians invaded my land, they could take my land. And he lived long enough to rue those decisions that he made. He was asked, who do you think owns this land? He said, from a divine perspective, I think the indigenous people own the land. But I don't know that they have the intellectual capacity to take good care, to be good stewards over the environment that God's entrusted to them. I would invite them to come to Richmond today and take a sip of water from the James River, which is full of E. coli from sewer overflows. I'm sorry I took a lot of time, but I'll come back another day and finish the story. Thank you.